Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on diversity, inclusion and respect in the Zoom age workplace. My name's Adrian, and I'm the head of GRC Solutions, which develops online compliance training on everything from anti-money laundering to health and safety and workplace behaviours. Now before we dive in, and before I get to introduce our wonderful guest, on behalf of everyone at GRC Solutions, I'd just like to pay our respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather. For us here today, that's the Gadigal people of Eora Nation. We honour their elders past, present and emerging because this is, was and always will be Gadigal land. And I particularly like to acknowledge any and all First Nations and Torres Strait Islander people who may be joining us today. Hello. So we're in for a real treat today with this topic, which I dare say is always timely, but has raised some fascinating issues over the past year, and in particular, I would say, over the past few days. Diversity and inclusion are concepts that are being increasingly normalised, I think, in today's workplaces. And honestly, they can sometimes be buzzwords that people just pay lip service to. But hopefully they are something more than that as well. Hopefully they're things that we're actively putting into practice and that we're thinking about when we make decisions at work. Diversity is about recognising and valuing our individual differences, whether those differences relate to age, gender, sexuality, culture, geographic location, socioeconomic background, or even cognitive diversity, which is differences in the way we think and our perspectives in our approach to things. Inclusion is about empowering different people to work together, not in spite of their differences, but through them. So inclusion is the state of being valued, seen and heard. And for me, the way I think about these things is that diversity is about having a seat at the table, and inclusion is about being seen and heard at the table. But what does diversity and inclusion look like in our workplaces in 2021, when our workplaces and our practices have changed so much over the past year, and maybe we've changed too? Now, I will say, by way of seeing and hearing, we can't actually see you out there, but we would love to hear from you. So if you do have any questions at all, or any insights or stories or experiences that you would like to share on this topic, please let us know, and please get typing away. This is very much an open conversation. And I would very much like to hear from our guest today. I'm very excited to have with us Professor Catharine Lumby from the University of Sydney. Catharine teaches media studies, and she founded the Media and Communications Department at the university. She's also a journalist who writes regularly for The Guardian and is a widely published author and consultant at Catharine Lumby Associates. And she's provided gender diversity, inclusion and ethics training to so many high-profile organisations. So, Professor Catharine Lumby, thank you for joining us.
Hey Adrian, thank you.
How are you today?
I'm good. A little bit wet, but apart from that,
it's a bit soggy today, isn't it, in Sydney?
Yeah,
so thanks
yeah.
for extra props for coming out today and making that effort. Can I start our fireside chat here today by quoting something that you wrote in an article?
Always.
Thank you. Great answer already. So you wrote a few months ago in The Guardian, "What if it took a virus to reboot our workplace cultures and humanise them?" So a year ago, we transitioned to working from home, and many of us are still doing that for at least part of the week. And through Zoom and other platforms, we've gotten to see each other's homes, our pets, our kids, our partners, our favourite pot plants, and in some cases, our studio apartments and bedrooms. Can we ever go back to separating our professional lives from our personal ones, and should that be something we even want?
Well, that's a great question, Adrian. I mean, this is what I was reflecting on in that article. I was noticing, being in, as everyone else has been, in lots and lots of Zoom meetings, that while we talk about screens distancing us from each other, in fact, through Zoom, we get to this point where we can see into each other's private lives, hopefully in a respectful way. And it occurred to me that what certainly women have been asking for a long time is an understanding that they might have young children or maybe ageing parents. Now this applies to men increasingly as well. And I was sitting in a Zoom meeting with a guy who I must say is kind of famous for being very abrupt and quite directive in his mode of conversation. And at one point, a young child ran into the room, jumped on his lap and smeared Vegemite all over the screen. And we all cracked up, and then he cracked up. And it was the first time I'd seen him crack up and show a kind of non-professional side. And I think that there's something instructive in that. He then started to ask, what's that photograph in the background, Catharine? What's that painting? What's that pot plant? To different people. And so I think that we have always brought our whole lives to work and our whole selves to work, but we're beginning to recognise that, particularly given how blurred our work and life boundaries are, that workplaces could be more productive, happier, and better places to be if we were able to recognise the fact that people actually are bringing more than just their professional, suited up self to work.
I love the Vegemite story. It makes me think of that professor who appeared in that BBC interview. Was it last year? Yeah. When his toddler barged in, and the strut, that confident strut of hers. I thought, actually, you're the one who should own the stage.
That's right. Yeah. And I mean, that's happened to me in TV interviews. And I think that we should sort of own ourselves and own the fact that we bring our whole selves to work. I mean, we've always got to be careful about not crossing private boundaries with people and working out what's appropriate, and that's part of the conversation today. But I actually personally think it's a fabulous thing. I guess I'm a low boundary person.
But it's interesting. I mean, absolutely, it's something to negotiate, you know, in a public sphere or in a workplace. But you know, every now and then I have heard people say, just anecdotally, oh, I wish we had more boundaries at work. I don't want to hear about everybody's personal lives. And then I think more often than not, it's somebody who told me what they ate for dinner, told me what their pet likes and dislikes are, told me what they do on the weekend and so on. So there's actually an element of privilege involved in being able to talk freely and openly like that. And it's a privilege that we can extend to each other.
I think so, and I guess this is one of the issues that we're all struggling with, as you know very well, in the workplace, is when is it appropriate to share and when is it appropriate to ask somebody something. So if I can give you an example, one of the hypotheticals that I've used in education, it's one I used recently, was Steve comes to a job interview, Steve is in a suit, and Steve says, when Steve gets the job, wow, this is a great place. It looks like everyone dresses the way they want. I'm really thrilled about that. And then a week later, Steve turns up in a frock with makeup on. Now, you know, the question that I posed in this...
I might know Steve.
Fantastic. I probably do too. But the question I posed in the hypothetical, which was interesting because I had a group of people responding to it, is it appropriate to ask Steve or to say anything about how Steve is dressed? What about if you want to know what pronoun to use with Steve? How would one negotiate that situation? And there are grey areas. So I think that with the public and private blurring, I think one of the challenging things for all of us is trying to read the room and take the temperature of someone else, because if you want to be welcoming to Steve, you've got to be careful. And these are not black and white questions.
I love the whole idea of reading the room there, because we're talking about levels of competency to actually be able to and literacy, I suppose, to understand what the room is actually saying to us. I was thinking about, just as you were speaking, about the American researcher Brené Brown and the work that she's done to talk about, you know, leaning into your vulnerability and being able to be vulnerable, you know, in our workplaces. So, you know, being able to lean into that sort of uncertainty and all the risk and the emotional exposure that comes with being our whole selves at work. But partly also that's about letting other people lean into their vulnerability and having that conversation about, well, how vulnerable are we happy to be in the room together?
And I think that we're having that conversation, and I know we'll get to this at the moment, about consent. But one of the things about consent in all its manifest forms is it's I think one of the things in the workplace is expert educators, GRC solutions being part of the solution there, and it's certainly the work that I do, is helping people work through scenarios and find script. A script sounds a bit formal, but finding the language to communicate good intentions, and being able to ask. And I mean, the example that I've been giving this week, doing interviews about the Women's March, and the big debate we're having about consent when it comes to sexual intimacy, is when my children were 5, and I've got 2 kids. I said to both of them, when you play in the sandpit and you want to borrow someone's doll or truck, you have to ask. And I said, and just because they say yes, it doesn't mean they've said yes forever. You can't take it home. They might, after 5 minutes, say, I want that back. So that's a negotiation. And so I think that's a very simple example, but I think that in the workplace, we're dealing with issues which are more complex than, just putting a suit on. And it's about finding the language which is empathetic. It's about demonstrating empathy.
Fascinating. So when we're talking, I mean, the word consent is obviously a big word that pops up or has popped up a lot in our media this week. But it seems to me that we have lots of different instances where that will involve and require consent and that conversation around, again, sort of how we empathise with each other, how that other person that we're speaking with might actually be comfortable with certain topics or things, and there's a constant negotiation that you might have with a colleague or with the people that you meet on the street.
Yeah, well, I think in everyday life, we're always making small ethical choices. I mean, I'm one of those annoying people who smiles at people in the street and says, hi, good morning. Now, I'm also conscious of people's body language, and sometimes you can see that someone really doesn't want to respond, and that's fine. So I think that the subtleties of human communication are very important in the workplace when it comes to respect, and to go back to your, I thought, brilliant analysis to respect not just for diversity but promoting a sense of inclusivity. And we have to be respectful that for some people they have high boundaries and they don't really want to be asked about something. And I guess the other thing I'd say, Adrian, and you and I have talked about this prior, is that if you're the Indigenous person in the room and every whitey is coming up to you and asking you to talk about indigeneity. I mean, one of my best friends, Professor Larissa Berendt, who's an Indigenous professor of law at UTS, wrote a book called Indigenous History for Dummies because she was so sick of explaining it to everybody. So we want to be careful we don't burden people with questions or ask them to speak for everyone who's like them, oh, you're Asian, or you're a woman, or you're gay, or whatever the sort of so-called diversity is, because we do live in a very diverse society and it's reflected in our workplaces, and it should be reflected more.
Absolutely. I'm just going to nod from now on while you're speaking. So can we just come back to that wonderful word you used, respect? Because I think at the heart of diversity and inclusion is this issue of respect. And fundamentally, it's about being decent to people, whether or not they look or sound like you or have the same background. So what would you say to people who want to do the right thing but don't know where to start?
Yes, so I think it's about. Well, look, I mean, this is a difficult area. Let's be honest, because I mean, some people have high emotional intelligence, so they're good at reading the room and reading other people. For some people, they may want to be able to do that, but it's difficult for them for various reasons, and that's where I think education comes into play in the workplace. That's why I use hypotheticals where you can get sort of 5 to 10 people in a group with a hypothetical. And what people can then start to see is that everyone has a slightly different take on what's appropriate, and people can talk about the language that you put around it, but also that people can say, this is what it feels like for me when someone says that. So a lot of it is really about checking in, I would say. So if you wanted to, I'd give a simple example. If a colleague of mine was crying, I would say, is it okay to ask you if you're okay? And then I might say, if I knew them quite well, is it okay to give you a hug? I'd certainly say, what can I do to support you? So I think once you start on that, is it okay, what can I do, kind of stance, then people will understand that what you're doing, what you're trying to do is the right thing.
What I'm hearing from that as well is that we're absolutely not pretending that it's not happening.
Absolutely. I mean, this brings up, Adrian, the ethical bystander issue. I think this is the other thing that people struggle with in workplaces. We get all this training on fraud. What do you see if someone's stealing? What do you do if someone's stealing a computer, or someone's ripping off the corporate credit card? We get trained up the yazoo about that. But if we see unethical, disrespectful, or even discriminatory behaviour, how do we call that out? And what do you say in the moment? So to use another hypothetical, for instance, you're at a corporate drinks function, and there's a junior female colleague, and there's a corporate client, and you can see that he is making her uncomfortable. He's had too much to drink. He's got her sort of in a corner, and you look at her body language. So at what point do you step in? Who do you talk to about that? How do you manage that situation? And at what point do you intervene? And I think that those are the sort of steps of the ethical bystander issue. It's often about what do you say, but also when do you say it, and who do you say it to?
We also use a lot of scenarios with our training at GRC Solutions, and we do actually talk about the bystander effect, in our workplace behaviours course, and it's precisely because there are so many bits and pieces to sort of tease out, so many implications to sort of think about. Precisely, who do you sort of speak to? At what point do you sort of leap in? Is it safe for you to do so? Is it safe for them to do so? All of that. So I can see there's, again, it comes back to reading the room and developing literacy and competency in that. So that's where we're talking about people who want to do the right thing and not know where to start. What about those who may be resistant to learning?
Great question. So, the way I look at this process is that, if we look, say, at the issue of sexual assault in our society, which affects men as well as women, but it's largely women, I assume, and I hate saying this, that there are probably 5% of people in the population we will never bring on that journey with us. And they're the people I want to see dealt with through our justice system and jailed, frankly. I have no problem with that. I have a law background, and so while I believe in the presumption of innocence, I think there are reasons we have criminal laws. But I think with the majority of people, it's about the persuadable middle. You're always going to have maybe 30% of people who are already very progressive and aware on these issues. And then you'll have people in the middle who are saying, right at this moment, because of the Women's March and everything, this is a big issue. And I think we're seeing that in polling. So what's happening is, because it's being called out, you're seeing people coming on that journey. And that's why it's so important to have the open conversations. So I think that in education, you can't presume you're going to change everybody. It's a bit like drink driving. In the 1960s and 70s, when I was growing up, it was fine to get a skinful and get in the car with the kids and drive home. Not that my dad did that, but people did. And then the way we changed those behaviours and attitudes was we used education, and we have ongoing education about that, but we also have penalties and we test people. So that's like taking the temperature of the culture through research. So all of those three things have changed most people's attitudes and behaviours. But there are always going to be people who get in the car and drink drive, and they need to face the full consequences of the law, in my view.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. And I'd love to hear any sort of experiences or insights that other people might have, or tips that people might have about how to sort of educate that persuadable middle and bring them along in the journey. So if you do have any sort of insights on that, please, by all means, shout out. Can I quote you again?
Sure.
Something here that you wrote a few years ago about unconscious bias. And I've got a question here about responsibility, but let me quote you first. You wrote, "We all walk around with unconscious bias, and that is why you need to shake people up out of their comfortable chairs, like these, and get them to see that their perspective on the world is not the only perspective." I guess my question here is, whose responsibility is it to do that shaking? Is it the role of, say, a minority to educate people about their perspectives? Is it the role of the majority to learn about different people and perspectives? Or is this a completely false binary?
Oh, I love you saying false binary. I think he's got an academic background, people. It just showed. Well, I mean, firstly, as I sort of alluded to before, I think one of the problems of always expecting people from a so-called minority to educate everybody else is a problem. So if I go back to women and the whole issue of sexual assault, I mean, the whole journey has to be about good men standing up with women, or good non-binary people standing up with women. I say that having a child who is non-binary, proudly non-binary, and therefore wouldn't like me just dividing the world into men and women. And so I think that it's critical, I guess if we're talking about workplaces, it's the role of leaders to be proactive in instituting programs, research, education, the sort of things you guys do, the sort of things I do, but a number of organisations do, to be proactive about bringing everyone on that journey. And not leaving it up to the so-called minorities to educate people. But it is a journey, and to bring other people in the workplace culture on that journey, we need to give them tools. We need to give them communication skills. We need to give them a reason to buy into this. And that's how you make it part of the DNA of the culture.
So it's interesting. Something you just said there made me have a think about my own experience growing up. So, I grew up near Cronulla in Sydney in the 80s and 90s. And I remember really getting these two very distinctly different messages, around me. One was, you don't really belong here. You're not really from here. And then the other one was, well, you were born in Australia. You're not really from somewhere else either. So it's funny that sometimes if you are the minority, you might be very confused about things yourself, and it might actually take a little bit of time to unpack things, much less be able to educate other people. So there is, again, it's a conversation, isn't it, where you're working with other people to sort of learn about yourself and also perhaps teach people about yourself while you're learning.
I love that. I love the way it's almost a dialogue with yourself as well as other people. And I think that what is interesting, well, it's interesting, I mean, I find it fascinating. You grew up in Cronulla. I can imagine. I mean, and we've talked about this. I mean, I came from Newcastle, which was very similar to Cronulla. It was a working class beach culture. And I went to Sydney University to study arts law. And it was a huge shock to my system,
right,
because I was going to university, certainly in the law school, with people from very upper middle class backgrounds, and their parents were often judges or barristers and so forth. And so I went on a bit of, I suppose for me, we were going to talk about intersectionality, which means sort of how does class, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, how are all these things interrelated, so that we can never just talk about gender in isolation, for instance, or ethnicity in isolation. And so you and I have come from very similar backgrounds. This might be why we get on.
Fascinating, isn't it?
But I sort of learnt how to be middle class, I suppose, through the process of studying law at Sydney Uni. But I remain very sensitive to the issue of class as a result, because I went on that journey. So I think it is an interesting and complex question that you're raising.
I guess what we're talking about here is, with diversity and inclusion in the workplace, as employers, in organisations, we may want to sort of include people and understand that, people want to or should be their full selves at work. But at the same time, we just have to take note that people can also be on a bit of a journey themselves. They might not be fully formed in their whole selves. They might still be sort of questioning or tinkering, if you like, with how they express their identity. And sometimes being inclusive is about acknowledging that people are on, a path.
Yeah, and I guess it comes back to what we talked about before, not asking people to speak for a minority, but rather, that's why I think bringing people together in groups to discuss hypotheticals where people can say as much as they want to say, I suppose, and understanding also that when we talk about whole selves, I'm sure you've been asked that terrible question, where are you from?
Cronulla.
Cronulla, exactly. That's your answer. But, it's we can make simple assumptions about identity, but identities are really complex. Who we are as fully human is complicated. Being human is a very messy business. And so I think finding ways of using education to get people to feel aware of that and to find ways of working better together, really, and being productive in that is very important.
So I think a key word that's sort of hovering in my mind at the moment is the word of fear. People might be resistant to learning about how to include others because they're afraid, and they frankly feel vaguely threatened by someone who is a bit different to them in some form or fashion. But also that someone might also be afraid to be their full selves at work. So ironically, the thing that people may share is just fear about the conversation, the open, honest conversation that they could have with each other.
Well, that's interesting. One of my close friends and academic colleagues, Professor Sarah Madison from Melbourne University, has most of her work is centred on indigeneity. Now, she's a white queer woman, and she wrote a fabulous book called White Guilt. Right. And it's about one of the things that stops well-meaning people from thinking about and joining up with Indigenous people is, oh, it's kind of not my issue, it's not my area. What if I'm overstepping the boundaries here? But as she said very powerfully in a lot of her work, and she works with Indigenous people, of course, she isn't just being a white chick who goes out there and talks about it, is, there are ways of forming alliances and getting rid of that fear and that guilt. And I think you're absolutely spot on. I think that that's often what stops people, going back to the example of Steve in the dress, not knowing what to do. How do you welcome Steve, but not think that you're unable to have a conversation? It's a question of when you do it and how you do it and who does it.
And you've touched on a couple of times now the use of pronouns with trans and non-binary people. That's certainly something that's attracted, shall we say, a lot of media attention over the last few years. And there's this general sense of, from people who are not trans, not non-binary, well, I don't understand any of this. I don't actually even understand where to begin with any of this. This was not something that I was raised with. It's not something that, I mean, the language itself didn't exist once upon a time. How do I even engage and approach the topic, much less the people themselves?
Well, my 18-year-old has been educating me. I've been on a journey. I thought we had genders sorted in the 1980s and 90s as someone who's worked a lot on gender and sexuality and equality. But I guess, my approach would be, if I was a leader or manager in that workspace, would be to immediately start giving people some resources to understand the issue. Certainly I'd be speaking to the HR team to ensure that Steve was safe and felt respected. And I'd be thinking about, in a sensitive way, giving people access to information. Because we're all on a journey of understanding identity. I don't think identity, this might be controversial in some circles, but I don't think identity is something that's fixed. You alluded to it before. You come from Cronulla. That might be just as important to you as any other aspects of your identity, and just as formative.
It's interesting because once upon a time I would have absolutely said I'm from Cronulla, I'm Australian, and focused on that side of my identity. It's actually come. I was interested in Western history, interested in English literature was my sort of field of studies. And it actually came about later on, where I thought, I have this whole other personal history and cultural history, and I'm just missing out. I'm actually just missing out on a really interesting part of my life, my own life story. So I take that point, identity is not fixed.
Well, I mean, and I know I keep referring to friends, but another example would be Tim Soutphommasane, who used to be the Race Discrimination Commissioner, who's now at Sydney University, who's the most fabulous man, and I've done research projects with Tim. I've had the pleasure of that. And I mean, Tim has got a really great sense of humour, and he jokes about people's nervousness about asking him, what kind of name is Soutphommasane?
Right.
And most people struggle to spell it, right? And he's very explicit in saying, it's fine if people say, where's your name from and what's your cultural background? But I think coming back to the sort of guilt and fear thing, if we can kind of find respectful ways of opening up those conversations, then that is also part of educating people, as long as it's not sort of burdening the person as a minority.
So you're a professor of media studies, among other things. So I feel like it would be remiss of me not to ask about, I suppose, media influence. When we talk about diversity, we get certain representations of diversity or lack of diversity, in the wider media. And I'm just wondering how that representation could influence, the way we think about diversity in our workplaces.
Yeah, I think, look, that's a great question. In fact, when I was mentioning Tim Soutphommasane, the project we did last year was on the lack of cultural diversity in Australian media. Fun fact, every national news and current affairs director in commercial television in Australia is a white man. I know, right? I'm loving your face. Right, that is not Australia, but they're the people who are basically making decisions about where we're getting our information and where the stories are being sourced, and that's filtering down through journalism. So when we think about mainstream, or what I call vintage media, but which is still influential, we're really, we're getting a very narrow casting perspective on who we are and whose stories are being told and what matters. And I think that does influence public perceptions. If we look at our parliament, we look at the lack of diversity there. I mean, Anne Ali's the first Muslim woman elected to parliament. I mean, we have so little Indigenous representation there. We have, I mean, when you look at the statistics on, say, Asian Australians, I think that's about 21%, and you look at who's in Parliament. I mean, look at Scott Morrison's cabinet. My oldest child, the binary one, said to me the other day that, and I'm not being party political here, but he said if you look at the current federal cabinet, it looks like, who's a real estate agent in North Ryde? Now, nothing wrong with being from North Ryde or a real estate agent, but what he was saying is there's just such a lack of diversity if you look at the federal cabinet, and that says a lot about our federal parliament.
I feel like I should be more inclusive of real estate agents of North Ryde in my life. I
did. I worked at Macquarie University
right,
in North Ryde,
right.
and North Ryde's a fabulous place, and real estate agents are great. They've sold me all my properties. But
oh, there you go.
Yeah, I've got nothing against them. But I guess I'm saying that the homogeneity is the problem, and there's nothing wrong with straight white men. Well, I live with one, but we also need to recognise that representation matters, and it does in the media because it's formative of what we see as normal. So what is the normal pole, and everyone else is a minority compared to it, and that's the problem, because the world is not like that. It's not binary.
Yep, absolutely. I love that. Thank you. I can tell you're an academic too. We've got a question coming out here. So, anonymous attendee, thank you for this question. It says, great discussion today, thank you. I am interested in how you see things from an employer's perspective. Often we don't know where the line is with employees, what we can say and what we can't. We also may be very accepting of difference in the workplace, but conscious that our customers may not be as open-minded. How should we deal with these issues?
Oh, wow, that's a curly one. I love it. Yeah. Well, I guess, that's a tough one. I mean, it's interesting, I think, one of the ways I'll come at this is it's interesting to see how many corporations, when they're looking at their triple bottom line, and they're looking at that includes obviously social responsibility, have become conscious that you can diversify your customer base if you are more inclusive, right? So if you want to look at just purely from a business economic perspective, then what you would say is, firstly, we know that cultural diversity, which includes gender and ethnic diversity and all those fabulous things, is more economically productive because you get more brains together in the room and you can look at things differently. And just going back very briefly to say mainstream news and current affairs, if they really looked at their business model and why their numbers are dwindling, they're not speaking to everybody. The business model and the advertising revenue would increase if they spoke to more people and they got more eyeballs.
So they're actually just missing out.
They're missing out. And it's the same with, I think, if we're looking at a business model with customers. Okay, you might lose a few people on the fringes who are hardcore, homophobes. Say if you're supporting Mardi Gras, some people will say, well, I'm not buying your product anymore. But what you will actually do is gain far more customers by doing that. So I think that looking at it from a business model perspective, if you do the research and you do the analysis, I don't think it's a problem. I think you will diversify and therefore increase your customer base.
I love that you neatly tied together about 3 questions there in one go. So, and that we can think of the media as people who also have, or organisations that also have a client base, and that we can not just diversify our approach to other people, but diversify our clients and organisations as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. And look, there's, as you would know, Adrian, there's excellent research on why a culturally diverse organisation is a more robust one economically. And I would say the same for the customer base because it's diversification.
I love that. This is not just a discussion about the moral and the ethical imperative. It's also about the economic imperative. There are economic benefits to diversity.
It's good business.
I love that. Thank you. It's a great question. Thank you. In a survey that you conducted for SBS a couple of years ago with Dr. Amira Aftab, you found that 83% of Australians support gender equality. So that's 83%. And yet 44% of women indicated that they have experienced gender inequality, which rises to 60% for young women. And a third say that they have experienced discrimination by the age of 12. I want to say that these are shocking statistics, but they're also not shocking at all. They're not a shock. It feels like in the abstract, people, the vast majority are saying that we support and champion gender equality, and surely we'd want to support that in the workplace. And yet, gender discrimination and inequality are still happening. How do you think that discrepancy between sort of the best intentions in the abstract and actual practice might be playing out or are playing out in our workplaces?
Well, that's a great question too. I mean, by the way, just for people's benefit, if you're interested, you can Google a documentary on SBS called Is Australia Sexist, which includes these really great social experiments where we're testing exactly what you're talking about. And it was interesting, one of the social experiments, SBS did this really well, not in a kind of corny, hokey way, where they cross-dressed babies, as it were.
Right.
So they represented a male baby as a female baby and vice versa. And they asked adults to come into the room and play with them and pick an appropriate toy. These were kids of the age of 18 months. And when they were told it was a male child, they uniformly picked up a football or a truck. And when they were told it was a female child, they uniformly picked up dolls or tea sets. So what we know is that, if we just talk about gender for a minute, that we live in a deeply gendered culture, and that the two things we notice about people when we first meet them are race and gender. So this is where unconscious bias becomes a really critical issue. So people are well-intentioned, but we're all, I guess, victims or survivors of unconscious bias, and that's why the sort of work that you guys do and the sort of work I do and other organisations do is important, because it's about getting people to reflect on unconscious bias, because people aren't biased most of the time because they're malintentioned. It's just something we've all been inculcated into from a very young age.
It's interesting, isn't it? There's almost a process of helping each other. Just assuming we all have unconscious biases. You know, we all make unconscious assumptions about the world around us, and it's a bit of a mental shortcut, as one of my colleagues put it the other day, that we use, and it can be handy, or we think it can be handy for us to use that shortcut. But I just love this idea that unconscious bias is something that we can work together on, that we can help each other understand them. So it's not about shaming a person necessarily because they have this bias. It's about saying, oh, hey, you might not have considered this perspective.
Absolutely. And I think that that's why good education, evidence-based education, is about helping people develop empathy. Because a lot of the time, I mean, sure, there are hardcore racists out there, or hardcore misogynists, or hardcore homophobes, or whatever it be. And like I said, there's the I hope it's 5%, but there's the hard, sharp end of that. But a lot of people really would like to understand more, and I think that that's, you know, that the workplace is a place we spend a lot of time, and that's one of the places we can help society do that better. And as I said, it's good business sense as well.
I love that. Again, I'd love to hear any sort of experiences or questions that people might have there. I've just got one that's just come up. I'm hearing that bullying has been rising through the COVID period with people working from home. What do you put this down to, and how can it be addressed?
So I think we talked before about public-private boundaries and Zoom and so forth. And I think one of the issues there is that people haven't been trained in this giant experiment, and that concerns me, that it's something we've all been scrambling to catch up on. And I think some really big conversations need to start happening about how Zoom affects people, or Microsoft Hang, or whatever it is, and how we use that technology better, because I don't think we're going to go back to a non-hybrid system. I think for business reasons, for a whole lot of reasons, we've learnt that people can be very productive working from home. But I think that some of that bullying has probably taken place in those fora because people haven't really been trained. And so that's got to be, in the same way that increasingly we have to be bringing the social media experiment into our discussions about appropriate behaviour in the workplace. And it does come back to the blurring of public and private. And some people may feel bullied because of the platforms that are being used. But I'd like to see more research done on that. It's a great question.
It's opened up a whole new vista, hasn't it? Because you've had millions of people in the global workforce that have transitioned to working from home in some form or fashion over the past year. And, you know, I'm thinking here that potentially because there's so much remote working going on, people, people might just keep, because the boundaries may blur between the personal and the professional, people don't always realise, well, I can still talk to other people if I'm experiencing this problem. Someone may have bullied me online. Cyberbullying obviously is a big topic. I don't have any other witnesses to this situation.
Yes.
I don't know who to go out to.
Great point.
So it's almost like our modern workforces have adapted to, or workplaces have adapted, and perhaps our resources also need to sort of adapt to this modern situation as well. It is something that we have been looking at with our training on workplace behaviours, and it's certainly something that we have been worrying about and thinking about. How do you cater to people when they've moved to a remote working situation? So great question, thank you. Just coming back to that topic of gender equality. So International Women's Day took place just a couple of weeks ago, and now in this country, as you alluded to, we've just seen these massive rallies take place all around in the March for Justice. Again, what do you think all of this means for our workplaces and our work?
Well, I think it's a reckoning and a watershed. I really do. I think that particularly younger women have found a voice that my generation didn't have. We knew what was wrong, but if we're just talking women, but I mean this applies to a range of people who are seen as minorities, we had to choose between our ambition and putting up with unacceptable behaviour. And we've seen a whole lot of attention paid to federal parliament as a workplace. Now, I was a journalist, I worked in the press gallery, and I remember what that was like in the early 90s. I'm carbon dating myself, people, sorry. I still feel you. And it wasn't always a pleasant place to be as a young woman, though I had some fantastic male colleagues. But we just got on with it and just said we've got to put up with sexual harassment, which is really what it was, in some circumstances. So I think younger women, and we're seeing this with the wonderful Chanel Contos from Kambala, who has gone viral with this big petition from a whole lot of young women at, in this case, Eastern Suburbs private schools, have called out sexual assault that has happened to them, which is absolutely tragic. But there's a lack of fear, and this comes back to the whole way in which social media is an organising tool and as a platform for stories about abuse and bullying and harassment and assault to be told collectively and not in single file. And that's where people have told those stories before. They've told them to the police, ultimately to the police if they're brave enough to do that, but often just to family and friends or to counsellors. And so what we're seeing, I think, is a watershed moment. Now, we're coming back to the workplace. What this means is this is not going away. It's not going away. There is now a reckoning, and even if we're just talking sexual harassment and sexual assault in the workplace, it's, if you just look at it from a risk and compliance perspective, if you're not on top of this, if you're not doing good research and education and training and all of those important things, then you're exposing yourself, frankly, to civil lawsuits, And the other way of looking at this is, if young women are being sexually harassed in your workplace, you will not retain them anymore. They're not just going to put up with it. So look at it as a business model perspective if you want, because the first thing I would do going into an organisation, if I wanted to understand what some of the issues might be, is I'd look at the churn rate. What's your retention rate? You might be pouring resources into recruiting great people, but are you keeping them?
I'm just nodding the whole time. So this could be, we could turn this into a meme or a GIF, with just me nodding the whole time. So thank you. And I think in some ways that answers my next question, but it is a question that I and others have been thinking about, and that is, what can women do to keep the momentum going? And I should say women and allies more generally. What can they do to keep the momentum going and to strive for change, considering that the agenda is so broad and it can feel overwhelming at times that, we're not just dealing with individual instances of, say, sexual harassment or assault. We're talking about women who in different parts of the world and throughout the country may not feel comfortable just walking the streets at night. So there's this fear and there's mental health implications as well that women have to deal with. So I guess, what are the next steps to keep the momentum going?
Well, I mean, that's a huge question. Actually, I saw something in the Batuta Advocate, which always cracks me up, and it was a little, talking about memes, it was a picture of a man with his keys clutched between his hands and walking past a group of allegedly drunk women, and it said, "Man, as he's been trained to do, puts keys between knuckles, walking past drunk women." Which is kind of a hilarious way of driving home the point that it's been seen as women's responsibility to call this out. But you mentioned allies, and I think that is a absolutely critical thing to understand, that if we don't stand together, if women don't stand with people who are being bullied or harassed on the basis of ethnicity, if we don't stand with our queer friends on the issue of homophobia, if we don't, so partly it's about alliances. But I think starting in our workplaces is critical to promoting broader cultural understanding and change. And as I said, it's good business sense to have an inclusive, diverse organisation. So there are good reasons that organisations should do this, not just because of the moral imperative and the social justice imperatives we're dealing with here, but because it actually makes good business sense.
I love that, and I think when you use the word alliance, I would just add that for me that's not a politically partisan alliance. We may disagree with each other on a whole host of issues. We should, in some ways, disagree on a whole host of issues and still go, we can respect each other, support each other, be there for each other, and know that this makes great business sense as well for us to do that and to keep talking to each other.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think that respect is an interesting word because, it can be seen as a sort of, and I know you know this, as a sort of lip service word, but I think starting conversations in the workplace about what does respect really look like and what language do we put around that. And so I always talk about respect for difference. I think the worst word is tolerance. No one wants to be tolerated, Adrian.
No, absolutely. There's tolerance and then there's acceptance, and there's a huge chasm between them.
There is a gulf.
I would love to ask a question that actually my colleague raised in conversation the other day, a very wise and brilliant colleague of mine. She said to me, a whole bunch of research shows that when you want to change people's behaviours, say to be more inclusive, actually having a reasoned debate doesn't actually do the trick. So often research might say, and I profess I don't actually know this research myself, but so often the research shows that people respond when they know someone personally who has suffered.
Yeah.
And it makes them realise that, something needs to change socially, something needs to change in the workplace. And I guess the question my colleague was sort of raising was, what does it take to actually change behaviours, to be more inclusive? especially if coming back to that term, we're resistant. People are resistant to learning.
Well, I think that it comes back to giving people a reason to buy in. And it's interesting because, you sometimes hear someone say, oh, well, I care about sexual assault because it happened to my daughter or my sister or the nice woman next door. And look, if that's what it takes to bring people to the party, fantastic. But that's why I think really good evidence-based education in the workplace matters, because you're giving people scenarios that make them think and give them a reason to care. And it also gives them an opportunity to hear from people, if they're willing to share their experience, what it felt like for them.
Absolutely, thank you. We've got a couple of questions just before we're out of time, but we've got a question here, and I love the language used. Could you double click on the idea of empathic leadership in driving inclusive cultures in the workplace?
Yeah, well, that's right, and that's great.
Yeah.
I will double click on that, or triple click.
Zoom age language.
I think that this comes back to alliances, and one of the things that we need to really promote in Australian corporate culture is empathic leadership. And our model of leadership traditionally has been premised on the sort of head kicker, and we immediately figure that person is a male. And probably white, and there's nothing wrong with white men being leaders. It's a question of a style of leadership. So I think the other thing about training and understanding is that form of leadership does not necessarily promote the most productive workplace, the happiest workplace, the place where you're going to get the most out of your team. So I think discussions around what is good leadership is very important. And that also raises a very important question. This is not just about training people at the bottom or in the middle. It's actually about leaders buying into good education and understanding that they have things to learn as well and bringing them on that journey.
I love that, thank you. We've got a couple of other questions and I think we might run out of time, but if I can just sneak in one more. Cathy, you have worked with groups like the NRL. How can their role model status be used to impact change when they have so many issues themselves?
Well, great question, and I ask this a lot. The thing is that if an NRL player does something awful, they're going to be on the front page of the Daily Telegraph. I've done research, 3 lots of it with the NRL, and it shows that actually, believe it or not, they're not that out of kilter with the same cohort when it comes to age in the general Australian population. But yes, they should be role models and they should be kicked off the field and out of the game if they don't model the right behaviour. But having said that, I guess that goes back to the point of male champions of change. And people like that can be used to educate others, and they're looked up to, for instance, by young boys. So I strongly think that we need to utilise those male role models where we can.
Thank you. What a great way to zoom through this interview and finish. Thank you so much for your time today, Professor Catharine Lumby. Thank you, and thank you for joining us today. We will be making this recording available afterwards, and absolutely, again, if you have insights or tips or thoughts that have come up as a result of what we've been discussing, we'd love to hear from you. So thank you again, and have a good day.
Great to be part of it.